صل على محمد. If we can move forward as much as possible, inshallah. صل على محمد وآل محمد. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا والشفيع لذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد وآل محمد. والصلاة والسلام على أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين المظلومين ولعنة الله على أعدائهم أجمعين إلى قيام يوم الدين. وفقنا الله وإياكم بعلم وعمل صالح إن شاء الله بذكر الصلاة على محمد وآل محمد. أما بعد فقد قال الله الحكيم في كتابه الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وكذلك جعلناكم أمة وسطا لتكونوا شهداء على الناس ويكون الرسول عليكم شهيدا. آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم. اللهم صل على محمد. Respected elders, brothers and sisters, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. This particular ayah of the Holy Quran highlights a very beautiful concept, a principle that has been established by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and it's proposed to us by highlighting the nature of the human being, how the human being has been created. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا, that we have created you a middle nation. Literally, if you were to translate that verse in this particular way, it means that we have created you as a middle nation. What does that mean? أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. Anything which is considered to be a wasat is considered to be between two things. The idea, the philosophy that is presented by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is that we have created you as creatures who should maintain balance. Out of all of the creation of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the human being, the way it is created, with the use of its aql, with the use of its intellect, the human being can create a balance within their lives, to not behave in any one of the two extremes. But when you look at the nature of the human being, if the human being is not guided by a superior power, by a higher authority, if we were to be left alone with our desires, naturally we would behave according to one of the two extremes. And you'll see this being profoundly projected to us from social society, for example, from the media. We are very, very influenced by what other people do. In nature, we are influenced by how we behave according to the environment that we place ourselves in. So if the media tells us to do one thing, and it does so, it projects that information to me for a long period of time, I'm conditioned to believe in it. If the human being psychologically, if it lies to itself continuously, eventually there comes a time when it believes that lie. You'll find that from every area, socially, economically, when it comes to, for example, politically, when it comes to, for example, theologically, in the things that we believe in, naturally we always tend to focus on one extreme or the other. Either we extravagate or we limit it. You find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala explains to us that the middle position is the best position. And I'll highlight some of the wisdom that has been given by the Ahlul-bayt alayhim salam. And naturally you'll understand that what they propose, the message that they teach, is a message that creates a balance within our lives. You know, this idea of creating a balance is common sense. It's common sense. But you realize that the circumstances within our lives become so difficult that this thing which is considered to be common sense is not so common. It's not something that is easily realized. You need a higher power to then intervene and remind you and I what our priorities ought to be within our lives. So you find, for example, on the first level, theologically, naturally the human being would focus on certain things which moves him away from Tawheed. When you look at the precepts of Tawheed, Tawheed is that perfect balance between which two extremes? On the one hand, you have polytheism. Polytheism is one of the extremes in comparison to Tawheed. The initiation of polytheism began in which time? It began in the time of Nabi Nuh alayhi salam. They say Nabi Nuh was only 5 generations away from Nabi Adam alayhi salam. Nabi Nuh was only 5 generations away from Nabi Adam. So we're looking at a very early period within human history. They say in the community of Nabi Nuh alayhi salam, there were 5 individuals that came before him. So Nabi Adam alayhi salam, and then you have Nabi Idris. When we speak about Nabi Idris, there's very little information that's given to us. Nabi Idris was the grandson of Nabi Adam alayhi salam. Then you have a few guardians who protected the message of these 2 prophets. These guardians, there were 5 in total. The Quran mentions their names. There were 5 in total. They were considered to be muttaqeen. They were considered to be God-weary individuals, cognizant of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's existence. They used to nurture their community. They were considered to be the forefathers of their communities. Just as how we have forefathers in every community. They used to have forefathers, the guardians of their community. But eventually, one after the other, they passed away. Now the people in that community, they mourned over their losses. They cried, they lamented. These are profound figures. Their hearts were broken when these individuals were, when they passed on. They say eventually what happened was there came a time when they were mourning, and in the process of mourning, Iblis came towards them. And Iblis said to them, it said that if you love them so much, why don't you remember them in certain ways or another? So how do we remember them? The narrations mention that Iblis, what he did was he created statues that represented them. So when he created these statues, he said, this is a gift from me to you. By looking at them, you can remember them. You can remember the good things that they did. You can remember some of the legacies that they left behind, and so on and so forth. It's a very innocent idea, isn't it? Today we have photographs. We have pictures of our family members, isn't it? It's a way of remembering them. So in the same process, in the same procedure, he left or he gifted them with these statues. Then he disappears. He comes back hundreds of years later. Generations later, he comes back. When he comes back to the community, these statues are now venerated. They're not worshipped, but they are venerated. They are held with high respect. So Iblis comes back to the community, and of course the community has changed, their mentality has changed, their rationality has changed. He comes to them, he says to them, what are these statues? Half of them don't know who these statues were. The historians of the community knew who they were, but the vast majority of people didn't know who these statues were or what personalities they represented. So Iblis then proposed the message to them. He then initiated the concept of polytheism. He said that these statues are not people who existed in history, rather they are gods that created you and sustain you. So that idea flipped entirely. And when the people were now attracted to the message that Iblis was proposing to them, eventually that began or initiated the seeds of paganism, of idol worship. Generations later, the community entirely had switched into worshipping these idols. Shaitan, one of the strategies of Shaitan, he doesn't convince a human being that Allah doesn't exist. Shaitan doesn't tell a human being or convinces the human being that Allah is non-existent, because he himself believes in Allah. He himself engaged in the worship of Allah. He convinces the human being that Allah is not deserving of worship. So that power, that fitratan power that we have towards a higher power, which is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he just detours it to a different direction, that there are other things that are worthy of worship, not Allah. And so eventually this created polytheism within the community. Very interestingly, when Nabi Nuh alayhi salam came, one of the challenges that the echelons, the authorities of the communities faced was they created a small committee. There was a small meeting. They got together and then they said to one another They said, do not abandon your gods. Do not abandon your gods. Do not abandon 5 from amongst them. Which 5? Wudda, Suwa', Ya'uq, Nasra, and Yaghuth. These were the names of the 5 individuals, the 5 guardians of the message of Nabi Adam as well as Nabi Idris alayhim salam. So naturally, you find that when these people began to promote and believe in polytheism, the first challenge that Nabi Nuh had in his time, which was the challenge of polytheism. Before Nabi Nuh, polytheism didn't exist. But this is what is known as moving towards an extreme, away from Tawheed towards one end of the extreme. The other end of the extreme is atheism. Atheism, and of course, if you remember the previous talks that we had, atheism comes under the folds of polytheism. It's one of the manifestations of polytheism. You know, some people have this question, it says, why does the Quran focus so much on polytheism? Polytheism is not a big issue nowadays. The bigger issue is atheism, isn't it? But we mentioned that atheism is the redirection of worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to worshipping something else, which comes under the folds of polytheism. A person may convince himself, by the way, I don't believe that there is a person who identifies as an atheist. No one with absolute conviction can come forward and say that there is no God. 70-80% of the universe is still yet to be discovered. Maybe perhaps God is out there somewhere, you just haven't seen him. Yes, technically speaking. No one with absolute conviction can say that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not exist. At most, they're agnostic. But the idea of atheism falls under the concept of polytheism. They follow their own desires, they follow their own, whatever it is they follow. Essentially, they do not follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So on the one hand, you have polytheism. On the other hand, you have what is known as atheism. These are the two extremes. Islam proposes the concept of a tawheed. When you look at, for example, Christianity and Judaism, the Quran mentions, of course, we believe, wholeheartedly we believe the message that was given by Nabi Musa, by Nabi Isa alayhim salam. It was the essence of Tawheed. But then later on, something happened and the message was concocted. It was fabricated. In the case of Judaism, they say that the early Jews, at the time of the Holy Prophet of Islam, likewise, they used to have this belief. They used to believe that Uzair is the son of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Have you come across any Jew who believes that Uzair is the son of Allah? With respects to this belief of sons of God, only Isa has that position, isn't it, in modern day society? Has anyone known or has come across a person who knows or believes that Uzair is the son of Allah? This was a belief held by the Jews of Medina during the time of the Holy Prophet of Islam. When you refer to certain academic circles, they look at the history of where this developed. The rabbinic Jews, very orthodox, very strong, old, ancient sect within Judaism, they held this belief. And they were predominantly residing in Hijaz. They used to believe that there are certain characters in history. Amongst them, Nabi Allah Uzair. Another from amongst them, Nabi Idris. They say that these prophets of Allah, towards the end of their lives, Allah did not let them die the way we die naturally. What He did was He allowed them to ascend to the heavens. When they entered the heavens, Allah stripped them from their humanity, converted them, transformed them into angels. And these angels were considered to be lesser gods or lesser creators. So now you're placing equals to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in the sense that they were the ones who created or took over the responsibility of creation. And these were known as the Metatons. Google it. The Metatons were these angels who were former human beings. So the Jews developed this particular belief. There was this idea of Tawheed, but then someone comes with a particular idea and then it changes the teachings that was originally preserved. Then you have, for example, Christianity, that Isa alayhi salam is the Son of God. That was instituted by the likes of Paul and so on and so forth. Academics today say that Paul was the first one who introduced the concept of Trinity. 3 in 1, 1 in 3, a very complicated idea. If you were to just probe this question, it's very difficult to answer. How can 1 be 3 and 3 be 1? In fact, many Christians are now leaving Islam and understanding the fallacy behind this particular ideology. How can there be three gods but is manifested in one? Or how can there be one God manifested in three, living at the same time, and so on and so forth? Very complicated concept and doctrine. And you find with it there are multiple interpretations. Again, the idea that one idea was presented by a person who concocted the original message of Nabi Isa alayhi salam. Rasulullah comes and he presents or revives the essence of Tawheed. And the Quran, the way it formalizes certain concept of Tawheed is perfect. In such a way that it correlates, it corresponds, it complements the aql, it complements the rationality. That's why people are attracted to the religion of Islam. We spoke about Islamophobia. We spoke about Islamophobia and the effects of Islamophobia within our societies. You know, one of the ramifications of Islamophobia is that even though it's rising and violence against Islam and Muslims is rising, many people are converting towards the religion of Islam. Many people are now seeing the value of Islam. Why? One of those values is that they understand that Muslims as a whole and the scholars from amongst the Muslim Ummah, they are preserving their values. They draw a red line and they are not willing to compromise in their tenets. You find, for example, within the religion of Islam, there are certain parties who are guilty of always falling into one of the two extremes. You find, for example, during the abuse of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam, Rasulullah, when he proposes the idea, when he then tells his community, he commands his community, إِنِّي تَارِكُمْ فِيكُمُ الثَّقَلَيْنِ كِتَابَ اللَّهِ وَإِتْرَةِ أَهْلِ الْبَيْتِ. This is a perfect balance that has been provided for you. I am leaving behind two things, the Book of Allah and the Ahlul-bayt. Adhere to these two things, you will maintain a perfect balance within your life. Leave one, adhere to the other, that balance is tilted. That balance is no longer considered to be a balance, but rather an imbalance. The abuse that the Ahlul-bayt faced, the oppression that they faced, naturally you found that there was a great imbalance that was created within the Muslim Ummah. And with it, oppression. With it, for example, different types of groups and different types of fadila that was given to these groups, and so on and so forth. During the time of Imam al-Sajjad, Imam al-Baqir alayhim as-salam, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. You had, for example, the sect known as the Murji'ah. Read in history, the Murji'ah. The Murji'ah were formulated by the Banu Umayyah. You see, people after Karbala, the sermon of Sayyid Zainab alayhi salam, the sermon of Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, this caused a massive rift within the community, within the Muslim Ummah. When they delivered these sermons, the people now knew the crimes committed by the Banu Umayyah. It was as if a new ethic was revived, a new version, a new insight towards how the Muslim Ummah was somehow, it was revived, it was made clear. As a response, the people began to accuse the Banu Umayyah, the government. They began to stand. There were many revolts were taking place within the Muslim Ummah. As a response to all of these threats that the Umayyad were facing, they got scholars together and they created what was known as the Murji'ah. The Murji'ah infiltrated into the Muslim community and they were telling people, do not blame the Banu Umayyah. They are your leaders. You have to follow them. And with it, there came fabrications, narrations from the Prophet of Islam that it is haram to stand against the leader of your time. It is haram to stand against the leader of your time. Well, what if the leader is oppressive? Sit down and have patience. That was the response. So when you now take all of these fabricated narrations and you try and understand the movement of Imam al-Hussein, that's why the Salafis today are saying that he was absolutely wrong standing against Yazid ibn Muawiyah. Why? Because the Prophet said it's haram to stand against the leader of your time. Anyways, they tried to react, or they tried to subsist all of these movements that were taking place by convincing the people that the Banu Umayyah are those who are in power and they cannot be judged. He said, look, they're Muslims at the end of the day. You can't judge them. Only Allah can judge. As long as they have belief, even if they engage in alcohol, even if they engage in, for example, promiscuity, even if they neglect their salah, you can't judge them. Only Allah has that power to judge. As long as they believe, this is sufficient. This was the movement of the Murji'ah. Then you have, for example, the Mu'tazilites that came. They proliferated during the time of Harun al-Rashid, Ma'mun. Ma'mun al-Rashid, he was very much influenced by the Mu'tazilites. What's significant about the Mu'tazilites? The Mu'tazilites, they focused a lot on aql. They gave dominance towards aql. Aql is greater than revelation. So if the human mind has this authority to understand Islam, you find that Islam was now being interpreted from a very philosophical perspective. They say Ma'mun was very much influenced by philosophy and logic. He would take the scriptures of Aristotle and he would study them, and he would then debate with the scholars of his time. One of the concepts that was initiated by the Mu'tazilites was that the Quran was created. In the creation of the Holy Quran. So naturally, towards the end of Ma'mun's life, he was so much influenced by the Mu'tazilites, he came forward and he said, infiltrate and gather all of the scholars and the judges within the Ummah and convince them that the Quran is created. So he tried to forcefully propose his ideas and his beliefs. Then you have, for example, the debates of Imam al-Rida alayhi salam when he combats all of this. This is the beauty of the Ahlul-bayt, the A'immat al-Athhar. Regardless of the challenges that they faced, they were always in the front lines defending Islam, trying to maintain the balance or bring people back to the balance. And of course, because of their knowledge, because of their ilm, because of their fadila, because of their akhlaq, people were naturally attracted to them. Imam Kadhim alayhi salam was in prison for a good portion of his life, yet Harun was scratching his head thinking, why are his numbers growing, his numbers of his followers growing? I've isolated him completely from society, and yet his numbers of his followers are growing. This is the power of the Ahlul-bayt alayhim salam. When you look at, for example, within our madhab likewise, within our madhab, forget the Muslim community, within our madhab you'll find certain individuals that will focus more towards the extremes rather than maintaining the difference. And this has also existed from the time of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. You have the movement of the Ghulat. What did the Ghulat do? They began to see the Imams as gods. They venerated the Imams. They lifted their status to the level of God, that the Imams are now in charge of creation, and so on and so forth. All of these beliefs were dominant during the Ghulat, during the times of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam. And he used to challenge them, and he used to even go to the extent of giving them la'na, that this is polytheism if you see us and recognize us and identify us as those equal to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But then the other extreme is what? At-taqseer. When people say that the Ahlul-bayt are just like you and I, normal individuals. They didn't have certain powers, they didn't have insight, they didn't have certain, for example, knowledge of what, so on and so forth. This is considered to be taqseer when you consider the Ahlul-bayt just like normal human beings like you and I. There are two extreme positions. We adhere to the normal, the middle position. That the Ahlul-bayt are not considered to be divine, as into the level of Allah, and they are not considered to be normal like you and I. There is a middle position. Today, for example, the attitude that we have towards the Ahlul-bayt alayhim salam, it's falling into one of these two extremes. I don't know if you've recognized this, but for the past 10, 20 years, there's been a lot of ideas proposed within the community. Go towards Karbala, Karbala, Karbala. The fadila of the ziyarat of Karbala, I can never deny. I can never deny this. But you have Rasulullah in Medina. You have Umrah to go towards. The Ahlul-bayt used to go towards Umrah. There is fadila in going towards Umrah. The Ahlul-bayt themselves used to go for Umrah and Hajj. We focus so much on one, we neglect the other. This is falling into one of the two extremes. We have to maintain a balance. I'm not saying don't go for ziyarah towards Karbala. Go. But also maintain the balance on the other side. Go towards Umrah. If it's easy for you and it's available for you, go towards the Umrah of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. See the Bayt Allah. See the sacrifices of the Ahlul Bayt in preserving Tawheed and making sure that that building stands. That symbol of Tawheed. So you find that extremes exist even on a theological level. On a political level, you see it performed by politicians, for example. Ibn Khaldun, a famous Sunni historian, very, very famous Sunni historian. He had some negative sentiments towards the Ahlul Bayt, but leave that aside for a moment. He was a historian and he was a masterful historian, a scholar in his own right. He's written a compendium And the title of this book is The Rise and the Falls of Empires. So he examines the empires that he's observed in history, civilizations. And he speaks about the rise and the fall, why or how they rose into power and why they declined, how that power was dissolved from them. And he says that there is a repeated pattern. And the pattern is that when you have, for example, a nation that is at its peak, they oppress their own people. They engage in injustice. Then you have a small party or a small group of people who decide to revolt. Their numbers grow to such an extent that they now have the power to revolt against the current power. And they overpower or they overthrow the government, the current government. When this new group comes into power, they come with the name of justice, but then eventually somewhere along the line, they too adopt principles of injustice and oppression. And they are guilty for the same actions that they stood against initially. It says that when that happens, then you find that it causes another group to rise within the community. So there is a circle, an endless circle of rising and the falling of empires. This is something that he came across. When you look at the Bani Abbas, for example, initially when they stood against the Bani Umayyah, understand this, the Bani Umayyah had many threats, many threats. You had, for example, the threat of Kufa, the threat of Medina, the revolts of Kufa and Medina and so on and so forth. But the revolt of the Bani Abbas were the strongest. And that's how the Bani Abbas were able to topple the Bani Umayyah. Initially, they came towards the Imam alayhi salam and they sought assistance and backup from the Imam alayhi salam. They wanted support from the Imam alayhi salam. They used to lift the banners enhancing the name of the Ahlul-bayt, that we are standing to preserve the principles of the Ahlul-bayt. We are fighting to make sure that the caliphate comes back to the hands of the Ahlul-bayt. So the companions, they came to Imam Sadiq alayhi salam and they said, look, this is good. We now have support from the Bani Abbas, then the numbers just are large. They can overthrow the corrupt government of the Umayyads. The Imam says to them, leave them. Don't support them. Don't support them. You don't know what their intentions are. Abu Safa al-Abbas, he was the first Bani Abbas or the first leader of the Bani Abbas. He ruled for about just a few months, half a year at least. And then Harun al-Rashid came into power. And we know the history of Harun al-Rashid. And the oppression that was directed towards the Ahlul-bayt alayhim salam. It didn't take long for oppression to be established by the Bani Abbas. So you find on a political level, you find there's always one of two extremes. Either oppression or absolute freedom, and so on and so forth. Then on a social level, the way we behave socially as individuals or even as a community, we always behave according to one of two extremes. If someone is rude and abrasive towards us, we break off all connections. We cut off all connections. We don't even speak to them. We don't even talk to them. We don't even look at them when they come towards the centers. We turn our backs and we walk the other direction. See, always moving to an extreme. There is always a middle position that you can adopt. Create boundaries. Create boundaries. Shorten your kalam with them. Say salam at least. Don't talk about certain things if it's a sensitive issue. Not to speak with them at all and to break off all communication is an extreme, and that is unhealthy. See, as human beings, whenever we come across a problem, naturally the solution is the other extreme. If someone was to, for example, criticize what we're doing, we're very much we're very much willing to say, you know what, I'm not doing it anymore. And that's an extreme. When you're doing something, your solution is to not do it. Do it, but create rules and regulations or change the way you're doing things. There's always a middle ground as to how you can approach something. So breaking up, for example, relationships. That's an example. The way we eat, the things that we eat. Someone wants to start a diet, all of a sudden it's the other extreme, isn't it? Cold turkey, as it's known in our language. I have to do something cold turkey. You're jumping from one extreme to the other. It never works. It works for only a few, and those are exemptions. Those are exemptions. For vast majority of us, cold turkey doesn't work. You watch a documentary about how bad sugar is. Tomorrow, no sugar. Extreme. I saw a documentary about how cows are being slaughtered. The other extreme is no more cows, no more meat. Then you have the whole veganism movement coming in. These are extremes. We need to adopt a middle position. Look at what Islam is saying. Islam is saying eat meat, but make sure there are certain conditions. Make sure it's halal, make sure it's clean, and so on and so forth. Eat, enjoy. This is a lidda that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given you. A sense of satisfaction when you eat. It's a form of pleasure. Enjoy, but make sure that it's under certain guidance in certain areas. Certain standards are observed. When you look at, for example, many different things, and you can come up with many different examples of how we behave, and our behavior is always aligned to one extreme or the other. When you look at, for example, working, sometimes you come across individuals who are constantly working. They don't know how to manage their time properly. They spend less time with their families, but they're constantly working. They see that they're doing well in their business, then all of a sudden they've started a second business. This is an extreme. You need to break down your time and how you spend your time with your family. Yes? Spend time with your children, spend time with your wives, and so on and so forth. Create a balance. It doesn't necessarily have to be quantifiable in the sense that you spend 4 hours here, 4 hours there, 4 hours. No. You know what your balance is. You develop your balance yourself. Develop a balance when it comes to work life. Do not become workaholics. When it comes to sports, the attitude towards sports is an extreme in itself. It's like the end all be all. The way some people have identified themselves with sports. It's as if certain sports define who they are as human beings. We are more noble than that. We have been given the aql. Use rationality. Let your aql represent and define who you are. Not all of these different external aspects of societies and so on and so forth. So now the religion of Islam steps into the discussion. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَكَذَلِكَ جَعَلْنَاكُمْ أُمَّةً وَسَطًا. We have created you as a middle community, a community that is able to develop a balance. Wasat, the meaning of wasat naturally means something which is adorned, something which is beautiful. And what Allah is saying here is that if you develop a balance, a perfect balance within your life, you will see that beauty emanate within your life. And the way Islam teaches us how to develop a balance, it affects all dimensions of our lives. A balance between responsibilities and obligations. There are certain obligations we have as Muslims. There are certain obligations that we have because of the responsibilities that we carry. The balance has to be drawn between the two. Theologically, for example, Islam demands that there is one God. This God has not abandoned his creation. He has given them tools. He has given them instruments, amongst them the Quran, amongst them wahi through the Ahlul-bayt. Use them to achieve perfection. Use the religion of Islam and the teachings of Islam to move towards Allah and perfect yourselves. Spiritually, physically, emotionally, psychologically, Islam has that ability. It's just that we have not tasted it yet. You find, for example, during the times of the Imams, you had opinions that were given by so many different individuals. You know, during the time of the Khulafa, you had certain individuals who used to be scholars within Christianity, Wahab ibn Munabbih, who used to be scholars within Judaism, Ka'ab al-Ahbar. What happened was when these scholars of the different religions converted to Islam, they began to interpret Islam differently according to their Jewish and their Christian lenses. So when you refer to some of our hadith, these ahadith specifically glorify Nabi Isa alayhi salam. And when you look at the chain or when you look at where it's coming from, one of these two characters are mentioned. So they used to reinterpret the Quran using their Jewish or their Christian lenses. And through it, a lot of fabrications entered the religion of Islam. Ka'ab al-Ahbar, for example, has a hadith. He says that every day, it's a ridiculous hadith, every day Masjid al-Haram prostrates towards Masjid al-Aqsa. Now what does that mean? It means that Masjid al-Haram is subservient to Masjid al-Aqsa. So when this person mentioned this hadith to Imam Baqir alayhi salam, he says, Wallahi fajjaruhu wa kadhabu. Indeed they have become fajr and they have lied. La'natullah alayhi. Their la'na is given to them. You know what's beautiful about these types of ahadith? This is where the Imam's anger would be demonstrated. The Imams, remember, their akhlaq is like the akhlaq of Rasulullah. It's very difficult to anger a person like Rasulullah, because he is the manifestation, the absolute manifestation of rahmah. He is a madhar of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's rahmah, a manifestation of Allah's mercy. It's very difficult to anger the Holy Prophet, likewise the A'immah. But when the religion of Islam is attacked, they demonstrate their anger. To preserve that balance, do not go to one of the two extremes. So you find that the religion of Islam draws a red line. Anything beyond, under, leave it, abandon it, maintain the middle position. Islam is perfect. When something is perfect, by definition, you don't need to add or you don't need to delete from it. It's perfect. Leave it the way it is. When it comes to our attitude towards wealth, you find, for example, the Ahlul-bayt have given us certain guidance. Even the Quran mentions some of these guidance. Do not extravagantly spend from your wealth. This idea of materialism, I need to have, I need to acquire, I need to expand my resources. Do not be extravagant. Do not engage in what is known as israf and tasrif. Do not spend what you cannot afford. Do not buy what you cannot afford. And do not spend extravagantly, buying things that you don't need. Yes, this is part and parcel of the teaching of Islam. Islam comes forward and says that, look, life is full of fluctuations. Today you're comfortable. You may not be so much comfortable tomorrow. Watch out for tomorrow. Tomorrow your wealth can be taken away from you. So you have the whole concept of money management that is now brought forth. They say, Ubaydullah ibn al-Zuhri, Sallallahu ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad. Allahumma salli. Ubayd ibn Zurara, the son of Zurara, who was a great companion of Imam Sadiq alayhi salam, he's having a conversation and the Imam says to him, Ya Ubayd, do you know how to become affluent? He says, tell me, Ibn Rasulullah. He says, do not engage in israf. Do not buy things that you cannot afford, and do not buy things that you don't need. Number one. Number two, save your money. Save. Because the time will come when you will need it the most. At least you have something to rely upon. So when the paycheck comes into your hands, don't go and spend it all together. Yes? Take a percentage of it, save it. Because it will help you later on in history. In the time of Nabi Yusuf alayhi salam, the whole concept of money management is shown in his story. When the king has a dream that the 7 lean cows have consumed 7 fat cows. So he wants to know the interpretation of this dream. Eventually they bring in Nabi Yusuf alayhi salam. What was the interpretation of Nabi Yusuf? You'll have 7 years of affluency and followed by 7 years of drought. This is the interpretation. What was the answer to this problem? What was his solution? Says, whatever grows during these 7 years, save it. Save it, because when the 7 years of drought come, then you can at least have something that you can rely on, and your community and your society can rely on. This is the essence of money management. Don't just live in the now, focus about the future as well. Take some of your wealth and save it, because a time will come when you will be in need of it. So you have money management, the idea of creating a balance, shown by the Ahlul-bayt alayhim salam. Do not overspend, but do not be stingy either. If there are people who are dependent on you, spend. Wujub al-nafaqa, as it's known within our fiqh. Yes, it becomes an obligation for us to look after our spouses and our children. Whatever they need to make sure that they are comfortable, it is our duties to provide for them as much as possible. Then you have the concept of zuhud. Zuhud that has been mentioned throughout the Holy Quran. When Allah speaks about the personalities, the prophets, the infallibles, you find that zuhud is part and parcel of their lives. Abstinence, asceticism. When the world is in your hands, but you are not corrupted by the world. This is a perfect balance that has been given by the Quran, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Do not denounce the world entirely. No one's telling you to go live in the mountains somewhere, isolated from society. No, be part and parcel of society, but be principled, have discipline, be with the people, but do not let the world consume you. Those disciplines that you and I have as Muslims, they create a barrier around us, a protective guard. Anything that comes towards us, it protects us. When the world shows its beauty to us, we recognize that, oh world, you are temporary. And these are reverberated in the message of Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salatu wassalam. Which I'll come to in a few moments. Then you have, for example, the example of Imam al-Rida alayhi salam. He's made the crown prince. Ma'mun forces him to become his second hand. He's considered to be the vice president of his society. Yes, Ma'mun the president, Imam al-Rida was VP. He was forced into that position. They say that when the Imam would walk into the street, one day a man came towards him and accused him of being those who have been succumbed by the world. And this was the strategy that Ma'mun wanted to play out in reality. He wanted the people to see that, look, this Imam that you're following is not of a godly nature. Look at him, he's like you and I. He's been overpowered by the love of this world. So he used to wear very expensive clothes. So this person came towards the Imam and accused him for wearing such lavish clothes. The Imam says to him, look what's underneath the clothes. And when the person saw, it was the harshest, the roughest clothing that a person can wear. He says, the position that I am in, I'm forced to be doing or I'm forced to show myself in this particular way. But look how I'm creating that balance. When the man saw the behavior of Imam al-Rida, you can imagine, show me any leader who behaves in this way. The world comes knocking on their doors, they denounce the world, but they create a perfect balance. They do not allow the world to corrupt them. When you look at, for example, Amir al-Mu'mineen, Imam Baqir alayhi salam, when he mentions the characteristics of the Imam, he says the way he used to live his life, he was the king. The whole Muslim empire was under his control. He says, but the way he used to dress, the poor people would look up to him. It was worse than the indigent of Kufa. When they would look towards the Imam, they would feel sorry for him, because at least they had something, or they would show themselves to be wearing things that the Imam didn't. And then on the other hand, when the rich saw him, they would learn from the Imam not to be so extravagant. So the Imam, just through his practical lifestyle, he was able to create that balance for the people around him. Then you have time management. Imam Kadhim alayhi salam speaks about time management. He says, split your day into 4. Create a balance between you and everything around you. Spend a time or portion with Allah. Spend a portion with your family and your friends. Spend a portion engaging in your work and your livelihood. And then the 4th, the final part, he says, enjoy what Allah has made halal for you. Me time, as it's known as, yes? So one part with Allah, engaging in ibadah, munajat. One with your family and friends. One with your livelihood. And one, me time. All 4, that creates a balance within one's life. Now how do we go about? That's for you to decide. How busy is your life? What commitments do you have? What responsibilities do you have? What obligations do you have? Take all the factors into consideration and try and create a balance for yourselves. No one can give you that answer except for yourself. As a community, you find that the message which is part and parcel within the Quran is to help one another to create that balance within the communal life. The Quran speaks about how we should develop spiritually. The Quran speaks about the spiritual level of the community as well. وَلَتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةً يَدْعُونَ إِلَى الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنْكَرِ. There is a community within every community, a small group, when they encourage people towards good, when they encourage people towards the ibadah of Allah, they engage in promoting good and forbidding evil. You'll come across certain people who are not willing to change. أُدْعُوا إِلَى سَبِيلِ رَبِّكَ بِالْحِكْمَةِ وَالْمَوْئِذَةِ الْحَسَنَةِ. Allah says that when you have resistance within the community, when they are reminded of good, when they are reminded of their responsibilities, He says, speak to them with kindness. Give them advice. Do not do so with the worst of akhlaq. Do so with the best of akhlaq. وَجَادِلْهُمْ بِالَّتِي هِيَ أَحْسَنُ. And communicate with them with good words. If they argue, argue back, but kindly, nicely, using good words and so on and so forth. Amir al-Mu'mineen alayhi salam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. You know what's beautiful with regards to the Imam alayhi salam? He makes 2 statements. two statements in Khutbat al-Muttaqeen. These two statements summarize our entire discussion. Now some of you may be thinking, why didn't he say this in the beginning? Huh? Two statements. If a person was to adhere to the principles of these two statements, it will affect him politically if he's a political leader. It will affect him religiously, theologically. It will affect him in the way he lives his life as normal human beings, part of a society. He says the qualities of the muttaqin is قُرَّةَ عَيْنِي فِي مَا لَا يَزُولُ. قُرَّةَ عَيْنِي فِي مَا لَا يَزُولُ. He says وَزَحَادَتُهُ فِي مَا لَا يَبْقَى. He says their eyes fall upon that which is everlasting. But then they disregard that which does not exist or which ceases to exist, which will not remain. Such a powerful philosophy the Imam is presenting. Many of us, we are convinced that the world is a source of perfection. You know why the world is not a source of perfection? Because the world can never give you perfection. The world cannot give you what it doesn't have, as I mentioned before. When it comes to wealth, power, influence, fame, all of it is just an illusion. Because everything will come to an end. Their focus is entirely on that which is everlasting. And that is the connection with Allah. A person, religious, muttaqi, recognizes that Allah is the source of perfection, so they connect with Him. Such a powerful philosophy, a single line can entirely change the way we live. And then he goes on to say, he says, نُزِلَتْ أَنفُسَهُمْ مِنْهُمْ فِي الْبَلَاءِ كَالَّتِي نُزِلَتْ فِي الرَّخَاءِ. The way they live their lives in the times of happiness, in the times of sadness and distress and sorrow, they're exactly the same. Their attitude is exactly the same. You've passed an exam, don't go celebrating like there's no tomorrow. You've got a promotion, don't go celebrating like it's the last day on earth. Develop an attitude where if you are in the state of distress and sorrow and in happiness, your attitude is exactly the same. Why? Because the world fluctuates. Allah gives you ni'mah, Allah takes away ni'mah. When Allah gives you ni'mah and you overly celebrate, when it's taken away from you, you will fall. And when you fall, you will not know how to recover from it. And eventually you will move away from Allah. Such a powerful philosophy the Imam is presenting here. In the times of happiness and sadness, develop the same attitude. When everything is taken away from you, you turn to Allah and you thank Him for the time that you had these blessings. And when Allah gives you the ni'mah, you thank Him for the blessings that He has been given. You look at the philosophy, for example, of Zainab and how she lived her life. Imam al-Sajjad and how he lived his life. They witnessed Karbala. They survived Karbala. But that strengthened their spirituality. They grieved and they mourned, yes, but they channeled those emotions in the best way by turning to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Allah decided to take away the son of Rasulullah, Ibrahim, according to some narrations Qasim. The Holy Prophet had a son and he was taken by Allah. He was a toddler, 2 years of age, very young. The Prophet was grieved. What was the communication? What was the advice of Allah? Inna a'tainaka al-kawthar. We have given you kawthar in return. Don't worry, we will recompense the loss of your child. فَصَلِّ لِرَبِّكَ وَانْهَارٍ. Turn to Allah, engage in Him, worship Him. This was the response of Allah towards the Holy Prophet when he lost his son. It says, turn to Him, worship Him. Wanhar, slaughter a camel and give as sadaqah to the people who are in need. Engage in number one, salah, number two, in sadaqah. Powerful philosophy. We undermine these small things. We know them, but we undermine them because we are looking for something else. When we find that something else, we realize it was the wrong thing we were looking for. So we go on a whole journey to find the response, to find the solution, to find answers, only to know that the answer was right there. Zainab and Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, when they witnessed what they witnessed in Karbala, they were able to preserve their identities and their values by adhering to the Quran, number one, and the Ahlul-bayt and how they used to live their lives. This is the answer as to how we can develop a perfect balance within our lives. Imam al-Sajjad, when he begins to characterize Abu Fadl al-Abbas, he says, Rahimallahu ammi al-Abbas. May Allah bless my uncle. فَلَكَدْ آثَرَ وَأَبْلَى وَفَدَى أَخَاهُ بِنَفْسِهِ. He was absolutely loyal till the very end, to the extent that he gave his own life for his brother. It's not only taking the Ahlul-bayt as guidance, but it is to be loyal towards them, submitting towards them. حَتَّى قُطِعَتْ يَدَاهُ, until his hands were severed and taken away. On the 10th of Muharram, Abbas alayhi salam approaches the Imam and he says to Abi Abdullah, after witnessing the slaughter of all the children and companions, he says, I don't have the patience to stand here anymore. Let me go and fight. He says, Abbas, there is a task for you. We need water. The children, Sukaina, Hamida, they are crying, Al-Atash, Al-Atash. We need water for them. Abbas, he then goes towards the Furat. The mazlumiyya of Abbas is that he did not bid farewell to the ladies and the children because he was going to get water. He was not going to fight. He was going to get water for them. Therefore, for that reason, he did not bid farewell because he was supposed to come back. They say as he heads towards the river, the Furat, 4,000 engage with him. But this is Abbas we are talking about. He repels a few, the other are fearful, they move away from him. Then he approaches the river. Or then, before even approaching the river, before even engaging, he cries out to the enemies. He says, Ya Umar ibn Sa'ad, this is Abi Abdullah. You have killed his family. You have killed his companions. Now his children are thirsty. Give him water. Shimr ibn Dhil Joshan replies. He says in response, he says, Wallahi, if the entire earth was filled with water and it was under our control, we would not give a single drop towards you. Unless and until you give bay'at to Yazid. Then Abbas engages. He repels the army. He enters the river. When he enters the river, the coolness of the water, he lifts the water in his hands. He brings it to his lips, but then he throws it away. I say to you, Ya ayyuhal mu'minun, if Abbas was to drink that water, would you hold him responsible? Would Allah punish Abbas for drinking? That desire to drink, Abbas is able to overpower it. This is the spirituality of Abbas. Then he calls out, he says, Ya nafsi, Ya nafsi min ba'd al-Husseini wa ba'dahu la kunta an takuni. هذا الحسين وارد المنون وتشربين بارد المعين. He talks to himself, he says, oh myself, this is Hussein we're talking about. This is Abi Abdullah. After him, if you exist, it doesn't matter. He says, this is Hussein approaching the clutches of death, and you drink from this water. He reprimands himself, he throws away the water, he fills the water skin, then he comes out, he mounts on his horse, then he proceeds back towards the tents. As he proceeds, they say 2 men ambushed him, they were hiding behind a palm tree. As Abu Fadl al-Abbas passes the tree, they came from behind behind him and he did not know. They struck his right arm and severed his arm. He calls out, he says, Wallahi, they have severed my right arm, but I will continue to defend the grandson of Rasulullah. He then talks to himself again. He says, O myself, do not fear death, do not fear these kuffar. Rejoice the mercy of Allah, the chosen one, Rasulullah. You will meet him very soon. Then as he carries on, the water skin on his left hand, they again ambushed him and they struck his left hand. When they severed his left hand, again he speaks to himself, O myself, do not fear these kuffar. They have severed your left hand. Look at their wretchedness. Ya Allah, take them towards the fires of hell. Then as Abbas continues, they see that he's not a threat anymore. They proceed towards him. They circle him. They shower his body with arrows. They say one arrow pierces his chest, one arrow pierces his eye, one arrow pierces the water. When Abbas sees that the water is no longer, one man comes before him or behind him with an iron pillar and strikes Abbas on his head. Then Abbas falls from his horse. He calls out to his brother, Ya Aba Abdullah, adrikni, adrikni. Imam al-Hussein, he proceeds towards Abbas. As he nears Abbas, as he approaches him, Abbas says to him, O enemy, do not come near me. I am waiting for my brother to come to me. Abu Abdullah says to Abbas, Abbas, it is I, your brother. He sits alongside him. He takes the head of Abbas, strokes it, cleans off the blood, places it on his lap. Abbas moves his head away. Again the Imam places his head on his lap. Abbas moves it away. He says, Ya Abbas, tell me, why do you move your head away from me? He says, Oh, Ya Abu Abdullah, you show me affection and kindness. You place my head on your lap, but who will place your head on their lap? Then Abbas leaves this world. Abu Abdullah then goes on to say, Al-an inkasara dhahri wa qillat hilati. He says, now my back is broken and I am now no longer have power. Sayyid Mahdi Bahar al-Ulum. This is a beautiful narration. Sayyid Mahdi Bahar al-Ulum, he was one of the khuddam of Abi Abdullah alayhi salam. He went towards Karbala because of his stature, marja of his time. They opened up the sardab to the basement of Abu Fadl al-Abbas. He was able to see the actual grave of Abu Fadl al-Abbas. So him and some of his companions, they lowered themselves. They went towards the basement. When they saw the grave of Abbas, it was a small grave. So they were questioning each other. Why is the grave of Abbas so small? We knew him to be tall. We knew him to be strong. When he would ride his horse, his feet would drag on the floor. He says, I don't have an answer to this. At that night when he went to sleep, Fatima al-Zahra alayhi salam came to him in his dreams. They say that he engages in a discussion. He says, oh my grandmother, tell me, why is the grave of Abu Fadl al-Abbas so small? We've read in the narrations that he was tall, he was broad, he was strong. Fatima al-Zahra replies, oh my grandson, Ya Mahdi, imagine how many pieces they cut his body into. That when Imam al-Sajjad alayhi salam, the narrations mention he had to collect the pieces of Abbas. Bishr ibn Hadlam, when he enters the city of Karbala, when he enters the city of Medina, he gathers the people of Medina. Then he says to them, he says, Ya Ahl al-Yathrib la maqama lakum biha. Ya Ahl al-Yathrib la maqama lakum biha. قتل الحسين وأدمئه مدرار. الجسم منه بكربلاء مذرج والرأس منه والرأس على القناة يدار. He says, Ya Ahl al-Yathrib, O people of Medina, there is no dignity amongst you anymore. Hussein has been killed, his body abandoned. With regards to his body drenched in his own blood, and his head has been paraded from one city to another. They say a woman from afar, when she saw the crowd, she came towards Bishr. She said to him, Ya Bishr, tell me about Abu Abdullah. Bishr did not know who this woman was. He sees the woman and an infant in her arms. He turns, he says, who is this woman? They say to him, this is al-Banin al-Arba'a. He says, Ya al-Banin, أعظم الله لك الأجر بولدك العثمان. He says, do not tell me about my son Uthman, tell me about Abu Abdullah. He says, condolence to you for your son Jaffer. Do not tell me about my son Jaffer, tell me about Hussein. He says, condolences for your son, condolences for your son Abdullah. No, tell me about Abu Abdullah. Then he says, أعظم الله لك الأجر يا أم البنين بولدك العباس. When she hears the name of Abbas, the child falls from her hands. She begins to cry and weep stronger and more severely. She says, Wallah, if you tell me that Abbas is no longer with us, then Abu Abdullah is no longer with us. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون.